Hello friends and welcome back. Today we are going to be doing my December reading wrap-up, in which I'm going to review and rank all of the books that I read in the month of December. Firstly though, we're going to go through the stats. These come from the story graph. So in December I read 18 books for a total of 5,438 pages, which is an average of about 302 pages per book. The moods of the books that I was reading were mostly adventurous, emotional, mysterious and lighthearted. More than half of the books that I read were considered medium-paced, about a third of the book were considered fast-paced, and just one book was slow-paced. A third of the books that I read were under 300 pages, 2/3 were between 300 and 500 pages, but I did not read any books over 500 pages this month. I read entirely fiction, no non-fiction to be seen anywhere in December. For the genres, my biggest genre was definitely fantasy. I think the story graph is classing 11 books that I read in December as fantasy books. Then the next biggest category is LGBTQIA+. Then we've got young adult, historical, graphic novel, children's, and some science fiction, and some other things as well. It is strange to me that middle fiction is listing as only one book, because quite a few of the books that I read this month I would definitely class as middle fiction. But anyway, it's an imperfect system, but that's the general gist. For the format, I read the majority of my books in print, in physical copy. I also read one book digitally and one book by audiobook this month. Then we've got our star ratings. My average star rating was 3.67, which is a pretty high average, I think. Those are the stats. Now let's dive into talking about the books. So we are going to start with my least favorite books of the month and work our way up to the best ones. Let's start with my 2-star books. So the two books that I gave 2 stars, honestly, I can't really choose between them which is my least favorite. But I suppose the book that I was personally most disappointed by would have to be The Stone Sky by N.K. Jemisin. This is the third and final book in the Broken Earth trilogy, which is a hugely well-acclaimed, very well celebrated fantasy trilogy, and I absolutely adored the first book, the 5th season. It's one of my favorite books of the year, definitely one of my favorite fantasy books that I've ever read. So I had extremely high hopes for the rest of this series, and I honestly thought it was going to become a favorite. The second book I did not enjoy as much, but I still gave it 4 stars because I felt like it was just a bridging book and that the third book was going to make that journey worthwhile, if you know what I mean. And clearly that was not the case. So not only was this a very disappointing read, it has also like retrospectively made me think less of the second book as well. I can't speak too much on the plot of this because obviously being a third book in the series, there would be way too many spoilers for what comes beforehand. But I will speak more generally about some of the things that I personally did not like and the reasons that I found this so disappointing. Firstly, I just don't think that the story was nearly as interesting in the second and third books as it was in the first. There were so many particular narrative choices and like reveals and twists that were just honestly jaw-dropping in the 5th season. Books 2 and 3 felt so much more like they were just like filling in backstory for the world. And like some of that was interesting, but an awful lot of it was not. Like the first book already set out what had happened for the most part. Like the world had ended in the first book. And so watching that happen and the people sort of respond to that immediate event was hugely fascinating and gripping. Books 2 and even more so book 3 spent so much time just explaining stuff to me as the reader rather than telling me a story. But it also over-explained the themes of the book, and I think that is what I found so frustrating as a reader. N.K. Jemisin is an author that I would describe as very heavy-handed with her theming and her, like the intention behind her story and what she's trying to say with her stories. And I want to make something very clear. I very much align with a lot of what N.K. Jemisin was talking about and exploring. Basically, I agree with her and I find the themes and the discussion topics hugely important and powerful. But as a book, as a story, as a piece of fiction, and as a reader, I didn't like reading this. I didn't feel like all that much really happened between the end of book 1 and by the time we got to the climax of book 3. If you've read book 1, you know that like the very last line is captivating and it's exciting because it hints to us what is going to come. But I personally didn't feel like books 2 and 3 really ever went beyond what I had like baseline expected by the end of book 1. So even the end of the world felt a little anticlimactic to me in this. I'm sorry if I'm sounding a bit harsh. I just was honestly so disappointed by this, and it was one of the like worst reading experiences that I've had this year, simply because I was so excited for this. I do like that this is a story of motherhood and survivorship in the face of so much heartbreak, oppression and violence. Now, I did go into the 5th season knowing that I had not really enjoyed a couple of other N.K. Jemisin works. As much as I respect and appreciate her, and I respect and appreciate what it is that she is trying to talk about in her books, I have to accept by this point that N.K. Jemisin is just not a storyteller for me. And that makes me really sad, but there we go. My first 2-star of the month. And then my other 2-star read of the month was also a fantasy sort of follow-up to a book that I really enjoyed, and that was Heart of the Sun Warrior by Su Lin Tan. This is the second book in the Celestial Kingdom duology, which is the follow-up to Daughter of a Moon Goddess. I actually read this in my most recent vlog, so if you'd like to hear more of my thoughts fleshed out a little bit more, definitely check that one out. And if you've watched that, you will know that I really enjoyed Daughter of the Moon Goddess, even if it didn't necessarily tick the boxes that I would normally assume I would like. I just had so much fun reading it. This, however, felt to me entirely redundant. It also felt much more tropey, and the fantasy and the adventure, to me, it felt like it took a massive step back so that the love triangle could love triangle harder than any love triangle. There was just so much back and forth, and because there is so little actual character development in this story, to me, it just felt really frustrating to read. On top of that, this book felt very chaotic. Like, both books, I think, are very fast-paced. They've just kind of got event after event after event, and they're very linear. There's not much meandering or side plot happening. However, Daughter of the Moon Goddess took place over decades. So it just sort of kind of felt, at least to me, like we were just getting the highlights of those decades. This book, at least the vast majority of it, it seems like it takes place over like the span of a week. And so honestly, it just felt ridiculous. Like the amount that they travel like so quickly, it felt like, you know, like the last season of Game of Thrones, how like they could just like magically appear wherever they wanted to. That was this. They would say they needed to be in another place, and then literally the next paragraph they were just there. So rather than feeling high stakes and fast paced, this just felt chaotic, ridiculous, and unnecessary. The only reason I'm saying that I might prefer this over The Stone Sky is simply because of the ending and the fact that she does end up with the person that I think she should end up with, and the way that it was done was quite cute. So the sweetness of the ending did remove a little bit of the bitter flavor that I had in my mouth, but ultimately it was not good enough to save a really frustrating and disappointing reading experience overall. Whew, okay, that felt pretty intense. It is not fun talking badly about books that I had really high hopes for, but let's move on to the 3 stars. My least favorite of the 3 stars is The Greatest Thing by Sarah Winifred Searle. This is sorry, it's a bit hard for me to flick through at the moment, but it's a graphic novel targeted to young adults. It's a contemporary coming of age story about friendship and body image and mental health and sexuality. This is another one that I read in my most recent vlog, and if you've watched that, you will know that I don't particularly feel strongly about this at all. I think it's fine, but it's not something that's going to stay with me. So let's not talk about it too much more. I also read Squad, which is a YA graphic novel that I read at work, so I don't have it here to show you. But this is a weird story about female rage. I don't know that I really feel like the commentary was done particularly well. It more just felt like a bonkers concept taken to its logical conclusion. It's basically Mean Girls, but the girls can also turn into werewolves, and they must feast every full moon. And because they're so strong and powerful and they have to eat meat anyway, they figure they're going to kill and attack and eat men who do bad things. Like I said, I don't know that the commentary on female rage and patriarchy and all of that stuff was particularly strong, but I mean the concept of these girls murdering and eating boys who are doing the wrong thing, it was a bit of good escapism, what can I say? Next we've got Evie and Rhino by Narita McMullen. This is such a pretty cover, and this is a middle grade story that I read recently for work. This is an historical fiction that is based on true events, and it's set in like the late 1800s near Melbourne. And basically our story starts with a bunch of animals coming to Melbourne on a ship. And this was based on true events with like people bringing in animals for the new Melbourne Zoo. And this ship did hit the reef and capsize. And in real life, the story was not a happy ending. But in this story, the rhino manages to kind of get to the beach, and he ends up meeting a little girl named Evie. She's about 10 years old, and she actually doesn't speak. After the death of her parents, she was really traumatized by that experience, and she hasn't spoken a word since. But in this story, we basically follow as Evie and Rhino just form this really beautiful sort of like intuitive friendship and connection with each other. So it was really sweet, and I did quite enjoy a lot of this. The only thing I will say, especially if you're thinking about purchasing this for a young person, is that I do feel like the actual tone of the writing and the voice of Evie reads fairly young, which I think just adds to the charm. However, there is one chapter about halfway through, a little bit after halfway through, in which we witness the abuse of an animal in captivity. It's not Rhino himself, it's a different animal, and it's sort of like in the past, it's someone remembering something that they saw and how that's really affected them. And it is pretty intense and it's quite powerful. And like, this book is intentionally trying to raise questions around the humane treatment of animals, especially in captivity and in zoos. So it is an important part of the narrative. I suppose I just found it a little bit jarring given the sweetness and the softness and the youthfulness of the tone of the rest of the book. So at the beginning, I was sort of thinking that this book was maybe for 7-8-year-olds, but I think that this is definitely one that I would recommend to 9+. And while the rest of the story is really sweet and beautiful and charming, if you are going to give this to a young person, definitely be prepared to have a conversation about animal abuse, especially in captivity and in zoos. Next, we have a YA. This is Unnecessary Drama by Nina Kenwood. This is just a proof. The current cover, like the actual cover, is a little bit different. And this is just good, solid YA rom-com vibes. In this story, we follow 18-year-old Brooke, who has just finished high school and has moved to Melbourne to study at university, and she's moved into a share house. Brooke is a pretty type A kind of character, and she finds out that the rules of the house are pretty simple. Just no unnecessary drama and no dating of roommates. However, when it turns out that one of the other roommates is Jesse, a boy that she went to school with and sort of had a complex relationship with, we'll say, things start to get a little bit messy. So this is an enemies to lovers romance, and I did enjoy it. It was a good fun time. It is quite playful and like relatable kind of comedy. I know a lot of people love this, and it's definitely an easy one to recommend. For me personally, as a reader, I mean, obviously I'm 32, I'm not the target demographic, but on top of that, there was just a lot of like the miscommunication trope going on throughout, which is not something that I personally enjoy. But if you are looking for a reasonably lighthearted YA rom-com, I don't think you can really go wrong with this one, especially if you do enjoy the enemies to lovers kind of thing and like the back and forth associated with that. And of course, it being set in Melbourne was a bonus for me. Next, we've got another middle grade. This is Mountain Fell by Catherine Orton. I picked this up from work primarily because of the cover. It just gave me vibes that I thought I would fall in love with. And I would say that this is definitely like a 3.5 star kind of rating for me. I did quite enjoy this, but I didn't love it as much as I was hoping that I would. This is set in a village positioned on one side of a very large wall. On the other side is a mountain where there is rumored to be a dragon and magic and all sorts of dangers. The people from the town are very scared of the dragon and whatever lies beyond the wall, and the children in particular know that that is a place they must never go. That is, of course, until some stuff happens and our main character Erskine must travel to the other side of the wall and venture on a quest to try and save her sister from the dragon. I really liked a lot of elements of this, especially like the magic and the uncertainty of everything that lay beyond the wall, and just how strange and unfamiliar it was for the children who were so sheltered in their town on the other side of the wall. I also liked some of the friendships that were developed in this. I thought there was some great character development throughout, and I also liked that when the kids went across the other side of the wall, basically things were not as they seemed, and what they had been told prior, it turned out that things were a little bit more complicated. And I really enjoyed the exploration of some themes around, you know, taking care of the environment and how greed can be so damaging, not only to the environment, but also to community. This one felt almost like a classic. Like, it reminded me of something that would have been published 50 years ago or something. It has a little bit of that old school fantasy quest vibe, a little bit fairy tale-esque. I really like the atmosphere and I really like the characters. Then my favorite 3-star read of the month was The Thursday Murder Club by Richard Osman. This was another book that I read in my recent reading vlog over the holidays, and I'm sure most of you have at least seen this around. This is a hugely best-selling novel. In this, we basically follow 4 people who live in a retirement village who have this little club that they get together every Thursday to chat about cold cases, like murder cases in the area. They drink wine and chat about murder. It's a good time. That is until one day that like an actual murder occurs on their doorstep, and they decide to involve themselves in this investigation and see if they can figure out what really happened. This is cozy murder mystery vibes, like the setting with the retirement village and so many of the older folks who live in this place. It's just like a lot of personality and playfulness to the narration and to the voices. And that was definitely my favorite part of the story. I didn't personally enjoy the way that the mystery itself was really revealed. It did feel like, rather than us like being dropped clues that maybe we did pick up on, maybe we missed, it really was just about being explained to after the fact, after someone had figured something else out off page. and they're just being sort of like told what they figured out. And so that wasn't as satisfying to me as I was hoping my very first murder mystery would be. I also felt like this was a bit too long for what it was, and there was too many characters. Like, there were so many characters introduced. It felt like every chapter, and there are a lot of chapters. These are very, very short chapters. Normally I love short chapters, but maybe these are too short. It's a 370-page book with 115 chapters, to give you an idea. And because those chapters do jump perspective quite a lot, it did feel, I guess, a little disjointed and jumpy from time to time. And yeah, just too many characters. Like, keeping track of John and Johnny in the midst of like 50 other named characters was just a little bit much for me. So primarily what I did like about this was the tone and the voice, and just like it felt all quite lighthearted, and it was just easy to read. What I didn't enjoy so much was the mystery itself, and also there's quite a lot of just like casual fat phobia throughout. And that was sort of like the personality of one whole character. But anyway, like, this was a fine, good time. But it was not the stellar standout that I was low-key hoping for. Now on to the 4-star reads. My first 4-star is volume 4 of Natsume's Book of Friends. This is a manga series that I've been reading lately that I've really been enjoying. It's just a cozy good time. I've spoken about it for the last couple of months, so I won't go into too much detail. So it is just really one of those things that I like to dive into from time to time as a little bit of a palate cleanser. It's cozy, it's cute, it's a good time. I like it. Next is the last graphic novel I'm going to talk about in this video, and that was This Is Our Pact by Ryan Andrews. This is a sort of middle grade aged graphic novel that I picked up from work recently, and I really liked this. It's basically the story of these kids who live in this town where every autumn they have this festival where they put lanterns into the river, and nobody knows where these lanterns go. Like, where do they end up? So these kids make a pact together that they're going to ride along the edge of the river and follow the lanterns, and they've promised each other that they will ride until they find where the end is. Like, there is no turning back. However, as the night wears on, more and more of the kids turn around, and we're left with just 2 kids who decide to continue on this journey. And as the story progresses, it gets a little bit magical and a little bit weird. They meet a talking bear, they end up trapped in the basement of some weird witch. A really fun, sweet story with just the right amount of magic. It's all about friendship. I had a good time. It was great. Then we've got The Dawn Hounds. This is the book that we read for my Blossom Book Club in December. And this is a queer, Māori-inspired fantasy. And I have to say that I really enjoyed the journey of reading this book, but it's kind of bonkers, and I don't know that I really understood all of it. But as far as I understand it, at least, this is a story about a queer cop who gets murdered and then resurrected and then joins a band of queer magic pirates before finally realizing that maybe the cops aren't really the heroes she's always thought they were. The plot was a little off the rails, and I don't know that I was always following it entirely. This is definitely the kind of book that I think I will want to reread in future, especially before the second book comes out, because this is going to be a series and I do want to continue with it. It just had so much personality, and although elements of this were quite dark, overall it felt quite playful. The world building in particular I thought was absolutely exceptional. It's this weird world where people live in like organic, like mushroom houses, and not in the cute cozy fairy way I know you're thinking about. There's also this really strange magic system that sort of ties everything together, almost like there's some kind of life force that exists that some people have been granted access to, and they can sort of manipulate things almost like it's some kind of like current of electricity. Like I said, I loved the characters, I loved the world building, I loved the themes explored. The plot left me a little bit confused, but this was just so weird and horrific and wonderful that I couldn't help but love it. It's definitely one of the more unique books, and definitely one of the more unique fantasy books that I've read. And even if I wasn't entirely sure what was going on all the time, this is definitely a world I want to return to and characters that I want to see grow more. This just felt fresh and I loved reading it. The next 4-star book was The Voyage of the Basilisk. This is the 3rd book in the Memoirs of Lady Trent by Marie Brennan. And obviously I can't speak too much on this because this is the 3rd book in a series, but suffice to say I'm still really enjoying this series. In this book we are being told the story of Lady Trent's experience going on a ship and traveling across the ocean in search of sea serpents to find out more about them and like their relationship to dragons. There is quite a lot of dragon action in here. I feel like in the first book in particular, the dragons were definitely there, but they weren't as present. We get quite a lot of like actual dragons on page in this one, which was exciting. On top of that, we definitely got more of Isabella's experience as a mother. Her son is a little bit older come this story, and so she's actually decided to bring him along with her on this journey. And motherhood is definitely one aspect of this story that I've really been enjoying. I think primarily because Isabella has a very different kind of relationship to motherhood and to her son than is expected of her. She loves her son, but it's not in this like overly doting sort of like stay at home kind of way, like she's supposed to do, you know? And in this book, I feel like we got to see that a little bit more of her navigating her own experience of motherhood and what worked for her and her son. As ever with the Lady Trent series, this was just a really good time. I always look forward to diving back into this world and to just like hearing what the ridiculous antics are that Lady Trent gets up to in her search for dragons. I also read a short story from the Lady Trent sort of world that was from the editorial page of the Felchester Weekly, and this is listed as 3.5, so I think you are supposed to read it in between books 3 and 4, which is exactly what I did this month. I just got it on Kindle. It was a really short, I think it was like 17 pages or something, and it's not really a whole story. Instead, it's more like letters to the editor and Lady Trent bickering with some guy who had submitted something that she thought was bogus. And so she was like challenging him publicly through letters to the editor. And it was just sassy and funny and just, it was just Lady Trent's personality coming through in a real fun way. So it wasn't anything like narratively exciting, but it was just quite fun and funny to read. Then the audiobook that I read this month was Even Though I Knew the End by C.L. Polk. This is another one that I read in my recent holiday vlog, and it was my favorite of those books that I read in that vlog. This is a pretty short audiobook that I got through LibreFM's ALC program. It's sapphic and it's set in the 1920s in Chicago, and it's all about like angels and demons and vampires and like weird occult shit. I loved it. Basically, we find out that our main character at some point in her past sold her soul to the devil. And in present day, she has been given the opportunity to win her soul back. All she has to do is find the most infamous serial killer in Chicago, who is the White City Vampire. And so she reluctantly agrees to this dangerous deal because she knows without her soul, she will not be able to grow old with the woman that she loves. Although being quite occult and dark in that way, this had such a fun tone overall. The atmosphere, especially of like 1920s queer scene with vampires, was just so fun. And the sapphic romance was absolutely beautiful. I loved this. I think the only reason I didn't give it 5 stars at the time is just because it was quite short. It is just a novella. I feel like if I had got a bit more of this, it would have been a favorite of the year. I loved it so much, and now I'm thinking maybe I should have bumped it up to a 5 star. I don't know. The star rating categories are always a bit tricky. Anyway, this was such a fun read. I loved it so much. Definitely a highlight for me this month. Now we are on to our 5-star reads. Firstly, we have Waiting for the Storks by Katrina Nannerstead. This is an Australian new release. It's a middle fiction title, and my copy is a proof copy. The actual books come in these like beautiful hardcovers. Katrina Nannerstead writes like kind of like a series of standalone stories about children's experiences through World War II. They're fictionalized, but they're based on true events and true scenarios. I haven't read any of them before, although I know they're hugely popular, and I'm so glad I finally got around to reading this one. This one follows a young girl who is Polish, and she's living in Poland with her family during the war, when one day she gets kidnapped by Nazi soldiers because she has blonde hair and blue eyes. And so we watch as our main character goes through the process of becoming Germanized, in which she basically is brainwashed into forgetting her Polish identity, taught German, given a false backstory so that she can be adopted out to a German family. And this is a part of history I did not know about, and essentially it's based on what the Nazis did to many Polish children who fit the like Aryan standard. They considered them lost Germans, and so to sort of like bolster their own population, they kidnapped these kids and essentially forced them to become German to survive. And this is obviously a hugely horrible and traumatizing experience, but it is tackled very well, I think, by the author. It feels very honest and true to a child's experience, but it doesn't like sort of overdo the really gory, horrible details. I think it walks a very fine line that makes this accessible and honest. I also really appreciated the author's note at the back of the book, in which Katrina sort of speaks about how maybe the ending might have been a little bit less happy in real life for most people, and how whether children survived this ordeal or not, overall it was just such a horrible, traumatizing experience. And these kids had to make choices that children should never have to make. Anyway, this was both an education and a really powerful, moving read for me that I highly recommend. I loved it. Next up, we've got another middle fiction. This is No Words. This is a book that I read for work this month. It's quite short, but it really packed a punch. In this, we meet several children, but our 2 main characters are Hero, this young girl who often feels like the name that her father gave her because he loves Shakespeare is often a little bit like high pressure to live up to, and Arya, a young refugee from Iran who doesn't speak. This has quite a fun, light tone, and there's actually quite a lot of humor throughout. And we watch as these 2 kids become friends, and as the story progresses, we learn more about Arya and his life and his journey coming to Australia as a refugee. We also find out that he has a passion for poetry, and he has learnt to be able to tell his story and his family's story through poetry. Like I said, it is very short, so I don't want to spoil too much, but I just thought that this was absolutely beautiful. There are some tricky things in here to read, especially about Arya's family and how and why they fled Iran. But overall, like I said, it just has such an optimistic, hopeful, beautiful tone to it that I found genuinely moving. It made me cry. I loved this. Then the first book that I read back at the beginning of December is Last Night at the Telegraph Club by Melinda Lowe. This is a young adult historical fiction. I spoke quite a bit about this in my favorite YA books of the year. I'll leave a link to that video in the description box below if you'd like to watch. This is set in the 1950s in America, and it follows primarily Lily, who is a Chinese American girl who's kind of figuring out that she's not straight. And we follow as she develops a friendship and then relationship with another girl named Kathleen, and they go together to a lesbian bar to watch a male impersonator. And of course, being in the 1950s, this is also at the height of, you know, the Red Scare and McCarthyism. And so much of this book is about the tension between those two worlds for Lily. The queer lesbian community that she's just dipping her toe into, and her Chinese American community. That is obviously a huge part of her family and her identity and is really important to her, but is also experiencing a lot of racism and intimidation from the government and the immigration department. I found this hugely powerful. I absolutely loved it. The writing is just beautiful. The relationship is just gorgeous to read about. It so perfectly evokes, I think, the sense of first love and that feeling of trepidation and uncertainty, but also the excitement that goes along with it. I felt like it tackled racism and homophobia and a whole host of really important topics very well. And the characterizations were just stellar. These are characters that I will remember forever. They're just so beautifully evoked through the writing and the storytelling. I loved this book. It has to be one of my favorite YAs that I've read of the year, maybe that I've ever read. I loved it. And then my favorite book of the month has to be Just One Damn Thing After Another by Jodi Taylor. I picked this book up at a bookstore. I came home, I read it all in one sitting that afternoon. This is the first book in the Chronicles of St. Mary's, which is a quite long series of sci-fi stories that feature a secret society of historians and archaeologists who, rather than studying history in the traditional way, they travel back in time to witness events as they happened. But of course, time travel is complicated and it's messy, so things often end in chaos. This was just an absolute romp. I had so much fun with this. It's quite high stakes, high action, there's a lot going on, but also the atmosphere of St. Mary's, like the institution itself, I just adored. And then there's also this great romance and just like the relationships in general between all the characters. It was just so fun. I don't think I've had this much fun with a book in quite a while. It's very easy to read, which explains how I got through a 400-page book in like 6 hours. But there's also quite a lot of personality and wit and just humor to the narration and the dialogue in particular. I did not think that this was perfect. I did have some criticisms of some choices. I think it just felt a little bit of its time. I think this was originally published early 2010s. And there were a couple of tropes in there that felt very much of that time that I didn't love. But overall, I cannot deny how much fun I had with this. I literally sobbed. I literally laughed out loud. I felt like I was like sitting there like bracing myself. Like I was so enthralled with this whole experience and I loved it. Which explains why behind me you can see stacked up the next 9 books in the series, because Blair bought me those for Christmas after seeing how much I loved this first installment. Unfortunately, I'm not really able to hold up all of these books for you in a nice little stack, but there you go. Those are the 18 books that I read in the month of December. As always, I would love to hear in the comments below what your favorite books were of December, or if you read any of the books that I mentioned in this video. Of course, a big thank you to my wonderful patrons over on Patreon, and especially big thank you goes to Livia, Lynette Brown, and Marie. And thank you for watching all the way to the end of this video. I hope you had a good time. I will talk to you in the next video, and until then, happy reading. Bye!